Welcome to the Lydia McGrew channel. Today we are wrapping up our short series on Luke's central section, which is an example of applying harmonization to a difficult section. And this is important. Harmonization is not only for easy harmonizations, and the fact that a section is difficult does not mean that a invention theory makes better sense of the passage. And it doesn't mean that harmonization is desperate historically, and we'll see that today. Today I'm going to be covering a puzzle about this central section that I haven't addressed previously in this series that used to really puzzle me, a puzzle that puzzled me. I would think about it and I would say, how does that work? Now, as you'll recall, if you've been watching this series or listening to this series, the central section of Luke starts with Luke 9:51, where it says that the days were approaching for Jesus to be received up, and he set his face to go to Jerusalem. And then there are several references to his traveling toward Jerusalem. And Luke meets back up with the other synoptics narration, I would say pretty clearly around Luke 10:31 is, sorry, I misspoke, around Luke 18:31, that he's once again pretty clearly narrating what the other synoptic gospels, Matthew and Mark, are narrating, and Jesus comes to Jerusalem then and heals the blind man and so forth. But in between, we have a lot of things that are what I call chunked in. It's not a technical term, but maybe we should start using it more. These include sayings, material that may even have occurred in Galilee, may even have occurred in very different sections of Jesus' ministry, because Luke just doesn't give them a context at all. He just kind of chunks them in. And it includes incidents where we're not sure exactly where it took place. So I've introduced yet again the concept of achronological narration, where the author is not attempting to give a chronology, and he's not changing the chronology from what he thinks it really was. That would be dischronological narration. Now, the puzzle that I was just wrestling with years ago started with that Luke 9:51, where Jesus sets his face to go to Jerusalem. And then in Luke 10:38, it says, as they were traveling along, he entered a certain village, and a woman named Martha welcomed him into her home. So this is the well-known discussion of Mary and Martha, and how they are taking different approaches to having Jesus in their home. Mary's sitting at his feet, and Martha wants her to help with the serving. And then Jesus says that Mary has chosen the better part. Luke just says a certain village. He may or may not have been told what village it was in. I'm inclined to think that since he often does mention geographical location, since he just here says a certain village, it may not have been told to him. John tells us that Mary and Martha lived in Bethany with their brother Lazarus. Bethany's on the slopes of the Mount of Olives. It's just about 2 miles, or it was just about 2 miles from Jerusalem. John emphasizes that. So he's close to Jerusalem there. And often when Jesus was in that area, he would stay with Mary and Martha. We get that from John, and even Mark mentions that he left the city and went out of the city during Passion Week. So it would be like he would visit Jerusalem, but he would often stay with them. So he's nearly there, right? If he set his face to go to Jerusalem. And then in chapter 17, verse 11, it says, and it came about while he was on the way to Jerusalem that he was passing between Samaria and Galilee, and as he entered a certain village, there met him 10 leprous men who stood at a distance. So at this point, it's chapters later, after Luke has said that he was unable to go through Samaria in 9:52 and following, and suddenly we're back there at approximately the border between Galilee and Samaria. So I wondered if he's setting his face to go to Jerusalem because the time is coming for him to be received up. Then he gets as far as Bethany. Why does he go back, all the way to the border of Galilee and Samaria? That area is known as the Jezreel Valley, which runs west-east, and I will include a map of the Jezreel Valley as the thumbnail for this particular recording. So that's kind of a loop. It doesn't make sense, or it doesn't seem to make sense geographically if he's going to Jerusalem because the days are approaching for him to be received up. Well, as I've discussed in this series, I am now convinced that the incident at Luke 9:51, where he's setting his face to go to Jerusalem and he's refused entrance to the Samaritan village, occurred when he was going about 6 months prior to his death, leaving his Galilean ministry and going for the Feast of Tabernacles. And then that the incidents after that took place roughly during what people have called the Perean ministry, which is confirmed in the other three Gospels and also by a connection with Luke 13 that I've discussed in another video. And so, there's more time in there. But we could still ask why, if he has ceased to have an actual Galilean ministry, he would go that far back up. The Jezreel Valley is not in Perea. Okay, Perea is on the east side of the Jordan River. Jezreel Valley is on the west side, plus being almost as far back north as Galilee. So if we take the incident in Bethany in Luke 10 to be chronologically prior to the incident in the Jezreel Valley where he heals 10 lepers in Luke 17, it is at least a little bit odd. Well, I'm going to give you two answers to this. One is my preferred one, which I'll give first. If you look at the geography in Luke 9:51 to 56, and then you put it together with his being on his way to Jerusalem and passing between Samaria and Galilee in Luke 17:11, actually the incident of the 10 lepers fits really well back there in Luke 9 at the beginning of Jesus' journey there to Jerusalem for the Feast of Tabernacles. It really fits well because he's refused entry to a village in Samaria, and we talked about how there's even an undesigned coincidence there with Luke 7 because he was coming after a bunch of other pilgrims and they were tired of pilgrims going to Jerusalem. And he goes to another village, it just says vaguely in 56, but it doesn't say where that other village is. So he could easily have turned and instead of just continuing south through Samaria, gone along the Jezreel Valley, and then gone across the Jordan River, and then gone south on the other side of the Jordan River. This was another way that pilgrims sometimes went. It was not as popular because, after all, he'd just been refused entry to one Samaritan village. Why keep trying more and more Samaritan villages? And that brief encounter during which he cleansed the 10 lepers, healed the 10 lepers, could easily have happened right then. So if we take seriously the idea that Luke doesn't intend to be placing these incidents in chronological order, he's just recording them, just kind of chunking them in, then to place the events there in Luke 17 with healing 10 lepers back in the time recorded in Luke 9:51 and following works really extremely well, in my opinion. Because he's right there geographically, exactly where that incident geographically is in Luke 17. And I would also point out that it's pretty unlikely that a person who told him about the incident of Mary and Martha, who may not even have been asked exactly where this was, would have attempted to relate it to the incident of the cleansing of the 10 lepers. And we know from the many vague references in these chapters, as he was going along, as the crowds were increasing, and so forth, that as he was on the road or whatever, that Luke is not apparently interrogating his witnesses in order to be sure to give a chronology. So those incidents of what I might call conspicuous vagueness in many places in this central section, I think show that Luke is not going to a lot of trouble to find out the exact chronological relation between them. I would also point this out. Any attempt to say that this location in Luke 17 in the Jezreel Valley, as he was going along between Samaria and Galilee, is a literary device really is unconvincing. In other words, if you try to say that it's dischronological, we might even say disgeographical, that he's making up the location and making up the chronology there, that doesn't make sense. So it's not that there is some fact-changing theory here that I'm just trying to avoid because I'm a desperate apologist or something like that. Actually, back in the 1930s, a scholar named McCown, a liberal biblical scholar, actually used the term literary devices for Luke's geographical notes in this central section. And actually, the geographical notes are kind of few and far between. But he said, Luke's just using that to give life and color. That was his phrase, life and color, to his narrative. They're just literary devices. Well, it's awkward even if he's just trying to give life and color, okay? After all, Jesus has just been right near Galilee and Samaria in Luke 9:51 to 56. Why narrate chapters and chapters of material, including notes of Jesus, going to Jerusalem, and suddenly in Luke 17 be saying he was going along between Galilee and Samaria? Okay, it doesn't really add life and color to do something awkward like that. Luke could easily have fictionally located this occurrence closer to Jerusalem if he wanted to. In fact, in Luke 18, he's going to mention Jericho. He could have located it near Jericho. Now, someone might object that there is the one Samaritan leper cleansed, so, he wanted to locate it near to Samaria in order to, include the Samaritan. Well, Samaritans got around. Jesus' parable of the Good Samaritan in Luke 10 has a Samaritan, and that's located. It's just a parable. He says he's giving them a parable, so it's not meant to be factual, as Jesus is telling it, but he locates it on the road between Jericho and Jerusalem. And there's the Samaritan. So to have a Samaritan in the story, you don't have to locate the thing in the Jezreel Valley right next to Samaria. So as a quote-unquote literary device to add life and color, that doesn't make sense. There's no need for that. That would be introducing an unnecessary awkwardness there. So dischronological or made-up geographical location is not a helpful theory. Now, as I've said, my preferred idea is that this is just achronological narration. Maybe Luke didn't even ask exactly when it took place, and that it is best located back at the time of Jesus traveling toward Jerusalem in 951. Now, suppose you don't prefer that. Suppose you're saying, no, it's so many chapters later, and we've had this incident in Bethany. I think this is intended to be chronologically later than the story of Mary and Martha in Luke 10. You can suggest that even though Jesus had this Perean ministry, it wasn't all that long of a walk. There were 6 months involved, And so he could, for whatever reason, have walked back as far as the Jezreel Valley, not intending to take up a Galilean ministry again, but just going back there. And then met the 10 lepers as he's, turning around from whatever he was doing up there and coming back to Jerusalem. You can do that. I don't happen to think that's the best, but that's another possibility during that 6 months. The thing that I want you to see through this whole series is how fruitful ideas like achronological narration and historical imagination and harmonization really are. We've actually come up with a couple of undesigned coincidences that I've talked about in other videos. So, as John Wenham said in his book Easter Enigma, the harmonistic method is deeply fruitful. It is actually historically reasonable to puzzle over these things conscientiously, as Wenham said, and see how they might fit together. And take other books like the Gospel of John and even Matthew and Mark that refer to a Perean ministry into account. So I wanted to show that in a difficult section. Next time, I'm probably going to be talking methodologically about characteristics like casualness in narratives and why they are probabilistically helpful to a particular view of the Gospels as memoir. Not sure what order I'm going to cover that in, but I hope you'll be interested and come back next time for that. Please like and subscribe to my YouTube channel. Please direct others here. And if you want to listen to this content on audio only, please check out the podcast. It's the same content, but just the audio, the Lydia McGrew podcast. Thanks again for watching or listening to the Lydia McGrew channel, where we're making common sense rigorous.